20, you might recognize this as the Ten Commandments. Then the Lord spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day, and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the foreigner resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and all that is in them, but rested the 7th day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And the second reading is from the 2nd chapter of Paul's epistle to the Romans. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with truth. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things, and yet do them yourself, do you imagine that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But by your hard and impenitent heart you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. The word of the Lord. I'll need that again in a moment. I'm a serious kind of fellow, which sometimes is a bit of a problem in doing some of this preaching. Because I'm about to tell you a joke and you're not going to laugh, because you say to yourself, Paul is always serious. And he's preaching a sermon, and he just read Scripture. So you don't have to laugh because I told you it was a joke ahead of time, but at least you know that it's allowed. Who knows who Calvin Coolidge was? Hands? All right, I want to talk to the principals at your schools. Calvin Coolidge was the 30th president of the United States. He was born in Vermont and was for a while the governor of Massachusetts before he became president. He was famous for not talking very much, for hardly saying anything. And it was difficult for people to get him to talk about stuff, which when you're president is kind of ticklish because people want you to talk about stuff. And he knew it, and he deliberately cultivated it. He sometimes played games with it. Once upon a time at a dinner party, a lady came to him and said, I just bet somebody that I could get you to say more than 2 words. And he said, you lose. So one Sunday, he was back in Vermont, visiting his parents, and going to church with his parents at the place where he grew up and went to church. And when he came out of church after worship, a newspaper reporter came up to him, trying to get a human interest story. Here it is, the president's gone back to his home church. And he said, how did you like worship? Mr. Coolidge said, And the newspaper said, well, the sermon, what was the sermon about? Sin. Well, what did the preacher say about sin? What did he have to say about sin? He was against it. And that was all the reporter could get out of him. He was against it. Well, we all know that we're supposed to be against sin. And we all pretty much know that we're supposed to be sinners. We're supposed to think of ourselves as sinners. And if I asked you the question, how many people here think they've sinned? You'd all hold your hands up because you know you're supposed to. It's a theoretical agreement we have. And everyone knows what we are supposed to think about that. And we have this prayer of confession that we say in worship every Sunday. I've moved it to after the sermon this Sunday. But we always have this prayer of confession. And I've taught Sunday school classes, and I've taught confirmation classes for junior highs and senior highs. And I've had people ask me, well, why do we do this? Why do we have this prayer of confession? Why do we try to make people feel bad? Right in the middle of worship, where people should feel good, should feel lifted up, should feel closer to God. And yet we put this thing in the middle of worship to try to make them feel bad. It's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit of a problem to explain sometimes. And it seems sometimes in the faith like we try to make people feel bad so that they'll know that there's a reason to turn to God. It's like a 1-2 punch. So we have these lists of things, like the 10 Commandments, and these prayers of confession. And sometimes some of these things seem impossible to obey. Love your neighbor as yourself. Most of us had a hard enough time just loving our family. Just loving the people we're supposed to love, our brothers, sisters, parents, children, spouses. And even if we're willing to do it, happy to do it, it's still a lot of work. It takes all the time we've got to spare. What do we got left over for neighbors? And then it says, love your enemies. Well, that's nearly impossible. And Jesus puts commands in a way that reaches down into the heart and doesn't even let us get away with obeying them on the surface. Do not kill. Do not murder. Okay, I think we can probably manage that one. And don't even be angry with someone in your heart. Nope, that's impossible. At least it's impossible for me. I presume it is for most of you too. That one goes a little too deep. Do not commit adultery. All right, we can probably manage that. That's not so terribly difficult. And don't even think of or desire someone else when you look at them. All right, does anyone know how impossible that is for teenage boys and young men? It's totally impossible. So we have this thing that sounds like, hey, we're creating this need, this feeling of failure and loss and whatever. We try to create that, and then we're going to sell you some salvation to fix it. It's like advertising. They do it on television and in magazines all the time. They show you something that you don't have to make you want it, and then they say, hey, we'll sell it to you. They try to create these desires, and they use sex a lot to do that. I mean, you stick a beautiful woman on a car, you can't buy the woman, but you can buy the car. You try to create a need, create the feeling of a need, and then sell something to it. That's what it looks like in advertising. And sometimes when we're not careful, that's what it looks like in church. We try to make you feel sinful, and then we tell you that we've got what you need to fix it. And whenever it's like that, then I think we've misunderstood what sin really is. So I want to try a little experiment this morning. I want to try a little experiment to try to figure out what sin really is. To try to get down at the heart of it. Down where it really lives. So, in a little while, I'm going to ask you all, if you think that you've sinned, to put up your hands. But I'm not going to do it now, because as I say, if I did it now, it would be automatic, because we know we're supposed to. So I want to escape from the picture of sin as breaking rules in order to try to look for something more important, something deeper, something more real to understand what sin is. So we're going to try a little experiment. Now, first of all, sin is sometimes thought of as law-breaking. We have these laws, federal, state, and local laws. And sometimes the laws are superfluous. And sometimes the laws are a little bit unjust. That's happened before. There used to be Jim Crow laws in the South that were unjust because they oppressed black people. And sometimes the laws are a product of political purpose. But they're laws, and we're supposed to obey them. But I don't think we can use those for identifying sin, at least not all by themselves, because they don't get at the heart of the matter. They just deal with external behavior. So, if you've ever broken the law, broken a federal or a state law or a local law, if you've broken the law, don't hold up your hand and admit that you're sinful because of that. All right? At least not just because of that. If there's not another reason in addition to that, then don't hold up your hand. That doesn't count this morning. Okay? That doesn't mean that you might hold up your hand because of something that's also breaking a law, but it means breaking the law is not the measurement of it this morning. And surely sin has more to do with values. And values we get from our parents and from our friends and from our culture sometimes. But most values are cultural, and they are different in different cultures. And moreover, we don't usually agree with all of the values that our culture gives us. And we almost always don't agree with all of the values that our parents try to give us. So right now, this morning, we're going to eliminate all values that come from other people. All values that you yourself have not thought through and agreed with for yourself. So if you've ever done something that your parents or your family or your friends or neighbors said was wrong, and you didn't agree, then don't count that as sin for this morning. At least not all by itself. All by itself. That's not a good enough reason to count something as sin. Don't hold up your hand. Now, sometimes we do things that we ourselves agree are wrong, but we feel like that we couldn't help it. Like it caught us in a moment of weakness. Or maybe we were sick or exhausted. Or maybe we were mistreated as a child and we haven't had enough therapy to get over it and to cope with it. Or maybe we reacted out of some early pain or a bad memory, and we reacted before we could stop ourselves. Or maybe we've got a psychological difficulty or a chemical imbalance in the mechanism of our brains, and it makes certain things difficult for us. Maybe we were under incredible peer pressure, and we didn't feel strong enough to resist doing something that we didn't think was right. So just for this morning, let's not count any of these situations. If you thought it was wrong, but you felt like you couldn't help it, like you just weren't strong enough, like you had some sort of excuse because of something that hurt you, then don't count that as sin for this morning. Don't hold up a hand on account of any act like that. At least not just because of that. And sometimes we do things that we didn't think were wrong at the time. But later we decide we were wrong. But at the time we didn't think they were wrong. It was further learning that caused us to decide eventually that was wrong. So for this morning, those don't count. Those don't count. If you didn't decide it was wrong until later, then it doesn't count as sin this morning, at least not for this question that we're going to come to. If that's the only reason, then don't hold up a hand for that. Now, when we do things that hurt other people, then we're most likely to recognize that we might have sinned. But sometimes the people that we hurt are people that we don't really know, don't really care about, don't really recognize how what we're going to do is going to affect them. And we say to ourselves, hey, I didn't know. Hey, I didn't realize. I don't know them well enough to know that that would hurt them. I would have been more careful if it was my wife. I would have been more careful if it was my best friend. I would have been more careful if it was my brother. I just didn't know them well enough to be careful enough. So just for this morning, let's not count those things. If it was just because someone was too distant from you, or you didn't know them well enough, or weren't closely enough related to them to care enough to really be careful, then just for this morning, let's not count that as sin, things you did that hurt them. Don't hold up a hand on that account. But most of all, sin is a religious category. We looked at the Old Testament, the list of the 10 words about sin. We looked at what Paul had to say about it in Romans. Sin is a religious category, and we think that religion defines the rules for what counts as sin. The 10 Commandments are the premier example. Now, I think that we misunderstand the 10 Commandments in some ways, and I especially think that we misunderstand the first commandment, and maybe we'll come back to that later, depending upon how we answer our questions. But when we misunderstand the 10 Commandments, I think we misunderstand sin as well. So just for this morning, we're not going to count it as sin just because we broke a rule that's in a Bible. Just because we broke a rule that's in the Bible, we're not going to count that as sin just for that, if that's the only reason that we might have thought that it was sinful. So don't hold up a hand on account of that. So what's left? In just a moment, I'm going to give you some time to think. And then I'm going to ask everyone who thinks that they have sinned in their life to hold up a hand. But we've eliminated almost everything that we usually use to measure or recognize sins. We've eliminated almost everything else that usually counts as sins. So what's left? The only things left are things that you yourself think are wrong. Because that's your own evaluation. Even if you might have learned it from somewhere else to start with, it's something that you decided you agree with. And not just something that you agree is wrong now, but something that you thought was wrong even when you did it. Something you agree with in your own heart and mind. Something that you knew at the time you did it was wrong, according to your own evaluation. Something that you honestly believed to be wrong, even when you did it. Something that you could have helped, that you could have done differently. You weren't trapped by it. The power to do something different was in your hands and you knew it. And you still did. And you still did it. Something that you were capable of rising above, but did not. Something that hurt, not a stranger, nor a mere acquaintance, but something that hurt someone you loved. Someone that you wanted to be good to. That you could see how it would hurt them. And you knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway. So right now, this morning, for the purpose of this survey, you're the final authority. Only what you consider to be sin counts as a sin. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about it now. We've eliminated all the rules that make the answer automatic. And I really have prepared 3 different endings for this sermon. It's not pre-programmed. Okay? I've got different possible endings. It's not a trick to force a certain kind of response for you. We're trying to find something out. So I want you to consider carefully what we've eliminated and what we haven't eliminated. And make a decision about how to respond on the basis of that. So I'm going to give you that time of silence we usually use after the prayer of confession. I'm going to give you 3 whole minutes. It's going to seem like 10. I'm going to give you 3 whole minutes to think about whether or not, on these conditions, you believe that you've ever sinned. Take time for thought in silence now.